She is one of the lucky ones, plucked alive late today from frigid waters of the Potomac River in Washington, D.C. A survivor, one of the few, from the snowstorm takeoff of Air Florida Flight 90, bound from Washington to Tampa and Fort Lauderdale. A survivor of the plane's collision moments later with commuter traffic on a busy bridge. Then a plunge into the frozen river. A survivor of today's disaster in the Potomac.
This is a CBS News Special Report. Disaster in the Potomac. Reporting from New York, here's CBS News correspondent Dan Rather.
Good evening. It was snowing. The Air Florida Boeing 737, with at least 76 aboard, took off from Washington's National Airport almost 2 hours late. On the ground, commuters were getting an early start home to the suburbs. They met violently on a Washington bridge. There are believed to be just 5 survivors from the plane, about 70 others believed dead, and at least 6 commuters killed in their cars. Perhaps as many as 17 people taken to hospitals alive, victims of the crash, victims of the rescue in waters cold enough to kill. It had begun with the element of snow. As Bob Schieffer reports now from Washington, it ended with all the elements of a cruel disaster.
Someone who saw it said that when the plane slammed into the ice of the Potomac, it was as if a huge rock had been hurled against a car windshield. Just seconds after liftoff from the airport runway, the blue and white plane struck one side of the bridge, skidded across the traffic lanes jammed with homebound commuter cars, broke apart and fell into the river on the other side. The tops of some cars were sheared off. Some who survived had to be cut out of the wreckage with metal saws and torches. Reporter John Goldsmith was nearby reporting on the traffic jam when the crash occurred.
At least 5 or 6 cars were simply destroyed by this aircraft as it was crashing. It knocked a truck almost off the bridge with 3 men in it. The truck was held up by the retaining wall. The plane took out that retaining wall, sheared it off, landed in the water, scattering debris between the 2 spans of the 14th Street bridges. Then the helicopter came in and started plucking survivors from the water. The rescue effort in this bitter cold with people who had been in the water for some time, trying to cling to life preservers as the helicopter lifted them out into shore, into ambulances, into people that could help them.
Park Service helicopter paramedic Gene Windsor.
That lady couldn't hang on to the life ring, and I had Don position the ship as close as he could to the water. As a matter of fact, we dipped into the water at one point, and I just lifted her up onto the skid, set her between my legs, and held on, and told him to take off with her. We were secure.
We just changed lane to come across the bridge. The traffic was heavy, and then we heard of a sort of swishing noise come over, and then all of a sudden, this was a large crash, and it turned the truck over, and we all flipped over in the truck, you know.
You see any bodies? You saw mostly equipment?
Fabrication material from the aircraft. It's apparently sunk. Now, I don't know how deep that water is, but it's all underwater. It's an underwater grave.
More and more rescue equipment was brought in.
Rescue trucks came and ambulances came and unsuccessfully got any of the people out, and then the helicopter came and saved them. I think got a few of them out. And the girl I jumped in after was hanging on to the rope that they dropped to her, and she just gave out, let go. I guess she passed out or just didn't have any energy in her to. So right after she let go, I jerked my boots off my coat and jumped in after her.
As night came, the recovery effort continued and a heavy snow began to fall. The wreckage was everywhere. It had been the first fatal crash at National Airport in 31 years. By 9:30, rescue workers decided no more could be done tonight and called off the search for bodies. It will resume tomorrow. Bob Schieffer, CBS News, Washington.
42-year-old Joseph Stiley, a private pilot, was among the many aboard Flight 90. Tonight, he is one of the few who survived to talk about it. He's in a Virginia hospital in stable condition, both legs broken. He spoke with reporters this evening, including correspondent Robert Shackney.
I am a pilot. I have a lot of flight time, and I've flown in 737s quite a bit. I knew we were out of runway, and I knew when we reached that point, I knew we weren't going to make it. I think the pilot tried to abort and realized that he couldn't abort, and he probably did the only thing he could do, which was to try to get it off at that point in time. I turned to Nikki and I said, Nikki's my secretary, and I turned to Nikki and I said, we're not going to make it, we're going in. I didn't hear anybody else say anything. I remember the first impact. I didn't know it was the bridge. It didn't surprise me. I knew we were too low and we were going to hit something. And then I remember the second impact, and I think the airplane went over on its back off the bridge, and it was the second one that knocked me out. I really remember the first one.
How did you get on the airplane?
How did you get it? Well, I was unconscious momentarily. It was the water that, I think, getting in the water that woke me up or revived me. And the biggest thing was remembering to take off the stupid seatbelt. The problem was that the ice chunks there was big chunks of ice in there, and you couldn't hold on to anybody. Also, there was one guy who was on the beach, on the bank, the DC side of the bank, that tried to swim in. I don't know who he was, but he kept trying to get out there with a rope. There were a lot of people trying to throw ropes down to us from the bridge, but we couldn't move. There was no way to move. The only chance you had, it seemed like, was to hold on to what was left of that airplane. There was a girl beside me that was in pretty bad shape too, and I tried to get the rope that they gave to us on her. Basically, what I did is I held onto the rope and let them drag me out, and tried to drag those two gals until we got to the shore. But the ice blocks just kind of knocked them loose. I couldn't hold on to them.
What was it like inside the airplane and in the water?
Inside the airplane, I don't have a visual impression of what it was like inside the airplane, to be honest with you. In the water, nothing was recognizable except a few people. I could see back after a while, after we'd been in there for a while, I could see that I was holding on to a piece of the tail section. The wings were behind me, back toward the bridge and back toward National Airport. And I could also see that it was sinking because it went down quite a bit while we were there.
You say you did hold on to a piece of the tail section for a while?
I held on to a piece of the fuselage.
What did you think when you felt the first impact and when you were holding on to the wreckage?
I figured I had taken one airplane ride too many.
For Joseph Stiley tonight, a bit of good news. His secretary, Patricia Felch, is in another Washington hospital. She is in critical condition with multiple fractures and exposure. Critical, but Patricia Felch is expected to survive.
From around the world and from CBS News headquarters in New York, this is the CBS Evening News with Dan Rather.
Good evening. Like most tragedies, it has more than one act. First, there was yesterday's crash of an Air Florida jetliner into the ice-covered Potomac River. Moments after taking off from Washington's National Airport, the Boeing 737 hit the snow-shrouded 14th Street Bridge, which was crowded with commuters. At least 74 passengers and crew died, so did 3 motorists. Divers today searched for 65 bodies, still trapped in the fuselage that's become a crypt under 25 feet of black water. But the final revelation of this tragedy, discovering the cause of the crash, may be months away. We have 2 reports, beginning with Bob Schieffer.
By 7:15 this morning, the big airliners were lifting off the National Airport runway once again. The bitter cold hung on, but the snow stopped overnight. The airport was declared open again this morning, and the planes were taking a flight path that brought them directly over the site of yesterday's accident. Down below, the tedious job of picking up the pieces and searching for the bodies resumed at first light of this gray day. President Reagan personally ordered the government to provide whatever was necessary to help in the recovery. A huge crane was positioned not far from where the Air Florida plane had rammed into the bridge during yesterday's commuter rush hour.
Okay, fine, thank you.
Cutters from the Coast Guard were brought in. Helicopters crisscrossed the area where the plane sank into the ice yesterday. It was the worst kind of work under awful conditions. Government safety expert Ira Furman.
Wreckage recovery, a lot of considerations in moving something this size, and its location relative to the bridges means we can't get a barge right up alongside of it or above it. So we're looking at cranes from the bridge, cranes from a barge, and what the options are, or dragging it out and then lifting it. We want to do as much as we can to document it in place before we move it.
It was decided that recovery of the bodies would not begin immediately because of the terrible weather conditions. But 2 bodies were discovered in the ice floes today, even before the divers had begun their first underwater assessments, bringing to 11 the number recovered so far.
It hampers the boats working in the area because they can't maneuver through the ice. The Army Corps of Engineers is, at this time, I believe, trying to put out a pontoon-type bridge so that they can work from the shoreline without trying to go back and forth on the ice.
By mid-afternoon, the snow had started again and conditions were becoming even worse. A pontoon bridge was laid across the ice to help the divers, and first officials of the Transportation Safety Board and then Transportation Secretary Drew Lewis toured the area. But as the safety officials explained it, the recovery operation would be a complicated process.
They're going down and they're going to make sketches of the fuselage, its position on the riverbed, so that the salvage people, the crane people, will know where they'll be able to put their cables, how badly the airplane is broken up, if it's in one relatively large piece or whether it's in several pieces.
The divers charted the wreckage until late afternoon, but with underwater visibility down to 0 and with the barge they were diving from beginning to shift dangerously, they quit for the day. With worse weather on the way, officials say it could take anywhere from 3 days to 2 weeks to recover the bodies, the wreckage, and the plane's flight recorders, which may hold the key to what caused the crash. Bob Schieffer, CBS News, Washington.
This morning, very near National Airport, about 50 people began planning the investigation of the crash. They represented the company which made the engines, the one which fueled the plane yesterday, Air Florida, the Federal Aviation Administration, and leading the investigation, the National Transportation Safety Board.
It's going to be a difficult investigation, I think, and it may take some time. For example, it might take some flight testing, and it may be necessary to load another airplane under similar conditions and determine exactly what its performance should be under the conditions that existed when this airplane took off.
They must search for many answers. Had the plane been properly de-iced? What was the condition of the runway in the midst of a driving snowstorm? Was the fuel contaminated? Did the engines, both recently overhauled according to Air Florida, perform as they should have? And there is the human factor. That is, what was the condition of the pilot on whose body an autopsy will be performed? And they will look at National Airport, the close-in but cramped, congested, outdated facility serving the capital. Pilots and air traffic controllers have long maintained that flying in and out is dangerous. Taking off on short runways, making sharp turns for noise control, and to avoid restricted flying space so near the White House and Washington Monument. But National Airport is only 6 miles from Capitol Hill. Very convenient for congresspeople, while more modern, less congested Dulles International is 35 miles away, Baltimore, Washington, 50 miles. Late this afternoon, CBS News learned that the Air Florida flight sat on the runway 21 minutes after its last de-icing before taxiing. Long enough, we were told, for the wings to ice up in yesterday's weather. The plane apparently took off properly, reached an altitude of approximately 400 feet, just long enough to register twice on the radar scope, and then went down. Lem Tucker, CBS News, Washington.